Hello, and thank you for exploring Lakehead International's videos. My name is Jordan, and I am the International New and Social Media Officer. I'm also the host of the Lakehead International Live series, a fun and informative way for you to connect with current international students, professors, and ask questions about admissions and everything Lakehead. You are about to watch a recording from one of our previous live sessions. If any questions arise throughout the video, please do not hesitate to comment below. If you would like to check out some of our upcoming live sessions, please head over to our website at lakeheadu.ca/international-live. Let's begin. Hello, folks, and welcome to another Lakehead International Live. My name is Jordan. I'll be your host today. We are joined by our very special guest, Dr. Benjamin Maiangwa, who is going to be doing a sample lecture. I'll do a quick introduction in just a moment, but first and foremost, I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, your evening. We're excited to have you, and today we are doing another international lecture showcase. Our topic on hand in the sample lecture we are going to be doing is politics of origin, which we're of course very excited to learn more about. But before we do that, like I said, we'll do some quick introductions and then I'll do a few of my housekeeping notes and we'll dive right into it. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jordan Ball. I'm the International New and Social Media Officer. I help run our live events, our digital experiences, our social media channels, as well as the Global Ambassador Program here on the Thunder Bay campus. With that being said, I'll pass over to our special guest to do a quick introduction and we'll continue on with the webinar.
Thank you, Jordan. Hello, welcome everyone to Lakehead. My name is Benjamin Maiangwa. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at Lakehead University. I joined Lakehead University in the fall of last year. And prior to that, I was at Durham University. At Lakehead, I teach courses in global political economy, global terrorism, and introduction to political science.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure having you. I'm really excited for today's session, but before we do all that and dive into it, I'll chat with our audience just briefly about some of the exciting upcoming events we have. So in the Lakehead Explored series, this week we have a session dedicated to applying for your student visa. So for those applicants that have already received an offer to Lakehead University, whether it's a full unconditional offer, whether it has conditions on it, maybe you anticipate you're going to be receiving that offer in the coming weeks, I absolutely strongly encourage you to join it. It's on Thursday, May 12th at 9 a.m. We'll be chatting all things applying for that student visa. Following that, we have a residence and dining session where you can explore on-campus living options and accommodations here at Lakehead University, both in Thunder Bay as well as Aurelia. And then following that, in one of our last sessions with me, is going to be our International Student Supports and Advisors sessions. We have really exciting webinars planned throughout the entire summer for those applicants that are transitioning from their home country to Thunder Bay or Aurelia, Canada. And so with that being said, I encourage you and I implore you to keep an eye out for some of those upcoming events. But for the time being, here is the Lakehead Explored session. If you want to register for any one of these events, you can scan that QR code at the bottom or visit the URL at bottom, lakeheadu.ca/international-live. In the Academics Explored series, similar to today's session, we have a few more international lecture showcases. Next week, we are doing criminology, surveillance, and psychology. And then following that, we have illusions in the science of psychology. So we have some really great sessions coming up. I'm excited for all of these. Once again, if you want to save your seat today, you can register at the link or QR code at the bottom of your screen. Final things to remember before we kick things off. If you like what you see, don't worry, we are recording today's session and we will be happy to share it with you afterwards. It will also be uploaded to our Lakehead International YouTube channel so you can get a taste of a sample lecture here at Lakehead University. If you do have any questions for myself or our special guest, please don't hesitate to submit those. We do encourage you to submit all questions using the Q&A function built into Zoom. The Q&A function will help us keep everything organized. If you are in the chat, you are more than welcome to say hello, let us know where you're from, chat with other guests on today's session. But like I said, all of those questions, we like to keep it in the Q&A. And last but not least, we do want to encourage you to stay connected and follow us on our social media channels for updates about future events, other webinars that you can participate, important announcements, and just simply to get a taste of the Lakehead University life. With that all being said, it is that special time where we are going to pass over to our guest, Dr. Maiangwa, who is going to begin his lecture, sample lecture on politics of origin. So I'll pass over to him when he's ready.
Thank you. So I will begin by sharing my screen.
I can't see your screen quite yet, but you're more than welcome to share it when you're ready.
Great.
Perfect.
So again, welcome to this lecture. I titled it The Politics of Origin, Belonging and Nationhood in the 21st Century. So the content that we will be going through today will begin with an introduction, which will kind of examine the obsession with the idea of belonging or origin. Then we would ask some questions after watching a very short video, and then explore again the concept and some of the practices of belonging and nationhood. And then we would also focus on this notion of who a migrant is, and we will conclude with the idea of belonging and the survival of the nation state. So introduction. Now, why the politics of origin? Why the politics of belonging? Um, I think you would all agree with me that we are at a juncture where we're experiencing the rapid increase in the mobility of people. People are seeking new opportunities for growth at home and abroad, and this has really generated the wider context for the present preoccupation that we have with the politics of origin, and particularly as it relates to the people we usually would refer to as migrants, the refugees, the asylum seekers, or even the nomad. And this concept, whenever we use them, they also denote why people move. People move for various reasons, and some of us will be moving soon to Lakehead. People move for safety, for refuge, for social economic advancement, for educational opportunities, and sometimes purely for adventure and tourism. When I left my own country for the first time, my ambition was to study and learn from people in different parts of the world. My ambition was to understand the basis of our sameness, our oneness, but also I was very interested in the dignity of our difference. So we are at a juncture where I think humanity faces a crisis of identity. So as I wanted to understand oneness and sameness, I was also struck about how we have been battling with the notion of difference, how we have been managing diversity. And I think that humanity is facing that crisis now over difference, over oneness, and sometimes between the universal identities that have been imposed on us, such as the notion of citizenship, nationhood, as well as the particular identities that we carry. So from the beginning of time, identity is not a new phenomenon. People have always expressed this desire to identify with something, to make meaning, to find protection, to associate with something, to be recognized. And these identities are expressed through various iterations. Iteration of race. We talk about race today. We talk about gender. We talk about class. We talk about nation. And if you really pay attention to these various iterations, they are also tied, to the ideas of territory. So if you belong to a nation, it also means that you belong to a particular land. You belong to a particular place. And especially, these notions are also tied to the idea of the border. And when we think about the border in this context, we think about both the physical borders that have been imposed, that have been created to separate nation state, but also the psychological borders that we create through the stereotypes and prejudices that we learn and express. So the border is a place, and the border is a notion that I will be using throughout the context of the presentation today. The border is a place, I think, where various identities are made, or where various identities, they collide. But it's also where identities are denied, where certain identities are denied through bureaucratic violence, or sometimes the violence of apartheid. So the border is one phenomenon. In political science, we deal with the border as a phenomenon that represents perhaps the most consequential binary of all. It marks the limit of governmental authority. One of the notions in political science that we discuss a lot is the notion of sovereignty and the notion of nationhood. The border marks the limit of governmental authority whenever we speak about sovereignty, because it sets citizens apart from non-citizens. It draws a line that separates those who are considered legal and those who are considered non-legal residents. So in a way then, the border is the frontier of the good life. The good life is a subject matter of politics. We study politics because, we want to make things better for people. We want the betterment of humanity. And so when we talk about the border in this context, we ask who gets what. The border determines who gets what, when that person or people get it, and also how they get it within a particular political community. So the mobility of people through borders, when we think about it in recent times, it has intensified. It has intensified due to wars, due to terrorism, climate change, and other planetary crises. But in order for us to kind of delve deeper into this notion of our identity, of race, of nationhood, of class, I have a very short video I would like us to watch for about 3 minutes, and then I will pose a few questions. And please, I would encourage us to interact with me and put in your answers using the chat feature on Zoom. So I'm going to play the video now and then invite you to respond to the questions subsequently.
Nationality feels so powerful. We fight for our country, we cheer for it, we draw our values from it. It's a big way many of us describe who we are, but it didn't used to be. Up until really recently, our identities came from stuff immediately around us. Clans, religion, family. If you think about it, nationality is weird. The idea that you identify with millions of strangers just based on borders, that's because national identity is made up.
And when all the pictures
National identity is the myth that built the modern world, but it also primes us for dictatorship, racism, genocide. Today, we're fighting over whether to keep that kind of national identity. To understand why, you have to see how new this idea is. So you think you know what France is. It's a place united by the French language and the French ethnicity, right? But as of the French Revolution, half of the people there could not speak French. Only 1 in 8 spoke it well. These are the languages that people spoke, just a patchwork that didn't line up with borders. We know from modern genetics that ethnicity didn't line up with borders either. National identity became the idea that language, race, and borders should add up to a country. Nations can't admit they're made up, so they invent a national mythology that says they've been like this forever. The modern era brought 4 big changes that led to national identity. People moved in big numbers from the country to the city, and they needed a common language. New technology like newspapers and trains made countries feel smaller and more interconnected. War was changing into this vast, all-consuming thing. Countries needed people to care so much about their nation, they'd fight for it in huge numbers. Governments were challenging religion for power. Here's Napoleon taking his crown from the Pope to crown himself emperor. It was a big deal. These 4 things sparked an era of revolutions and democracy, but they also unleashed ideas of nationalism, militarism, and leader worship. People came to see their countries as extensions of themselves. This new identity meant that a nation got its authority not from the government or the king or God, but from the people. This changed the world, but it also changed how we think. National identity changes our reality. We experience whatever happens to our nation as if it happened to us. Rocky IV can tell us a lot about what national identity does to our brains.
The Russian towers above the Americans.
A 1994 study tested the attitudes of Americans watching the movie. It includes an amazing footnote. All 216 participants were women because, quote, there were no males who had not seen Rocky IV. Anyway, when Rocky beat his Russian opponent, participants who strongly identified as American felt a boost in self-esteem. When they were shown re-edited footage to make it look like Rocky lost, they felt a drop in self-esteem, and they became likelier to hold negative views about Russians. But when they said something bad about Russians, their self-esteem recovered. And when we feel threatened, it makes us want to humiliate and dominate the outsider. That dynamic doesn't just apply to individuals. It can apply to whole societies. This can drive war itself. One study found that any country whose team plays in the World Cup becomes likelier to launch attacks abroad. That hostility also plays out against minorities and migrants who don't fit the national myth. It only took a century for these problems of modern nationalism to culminate into World War II, something so terrible it convinced the world to try a new kind of national identity. This model of identity is based on an idea from the United States. Anyone can be American if you share values like freedom and hard work.
May I please remind you that it does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty.
It's a stirring idea, but it never completely worked.
Your race is your nation.
If you don't speak English and don't contribute, get out.
The belief that being American is really about race, religion, and language also runs throughout history. So what makes a country? Which identity should matter? That fight defines so much of the world right now, and it's intensifying. You see it in the backlash to the European Union.
We've got our country back.
You see it in how Donald Trump began his campaign.
We either have a country or we don't, and it's...
So I'm going to stop it here, and we can engage the questions.
Awesome, for sure. Did we want to kick it off with the very first question?
Definitely.
Awesome. I will put that in the chat for everyone to consider, and I strongly encourage participation. It will certainly enhance your own experience in the overall webinar, and it will be an open discussion, very similar to a classic lecture here at Lakehead University. So Dr. Maiangwa, I've put it in the chat, and if you would like to read it to the audience.
Great. So the first question we have here is, from where did people get their identities before the concept of a nation or a culture emerged? So how do you think, from religion, family? Good answers.
This is really gonna be a telling story of who may have been paying attention during that video. I'm not gonna steal the thunder though. I think I have a few more to add, but we'll see what else rolls in. So once again, the question is, from where did people get their identities before the concept of nation, culture, identity emerge?
According to Emma, identity was based on skill set and what you could provide for a society. Very good answer. The languages, according to Paula. Thank you. George says, yes, religion, occupation, and family provided identity to individuals. Pierre also says family and community in a small scale. Thank you all for the contribution. Maybe we can move to the next question.
For sure. It's once again in the chat, I'll let you read it to the audience.
Okay. So the next question is, what part of you do you think would disappear if you weren't a citizen of your country or a member of your family or community? So some of you said you got your identity prior to the concept of the nation from family. So if you weren't a member of a family or a community, what part of you do you think would disappear? Would you still be the same without your family, without your community? A sense of belonging, according to Yichen. Feeling of security, you might find a surrogate family around you. A sense of responsibility, okay? Because you would then not be responsible to anyone, right? Accountability, very good answers.
Alrighty, so I will put the next question in the chat and I'll once again let you read it off.
So the next question here we have is, what is fundamental to your identity? When you think about yourself, what is the most important feature of your identity that makes you who you are? Is it your race? Is it your sexuality? Is it the language that you speak? Is it how you speak the language? Or is it the place that you live in? Or is it all these things together and more? Emma says, as someone who is a thought culture kid, I think my identity is constantly defined and redefined by the culture and people around me. George says, race, place, and language are essential to my identity. Hannah says, my values and identity. And Paula, attitude towards human rights. Fatima, language and race. Yanchin, place and value. Sheriff, race, language, accent, and place. Lovepreet, my place and language. Very good answers. Yichen, language. Every time I speak Mandarin, I think of the core values of my culture. Great, great. All right. Paula says, sometimes it's difficult to think about these defining features because they seem invisible to me. Exactly. They are very intangible notions. History, according to Upper Room. Great. Ideology. And Paula's response about invisibility actually is how many people would define nationality or nationalism. They will say it's an imagined idea. The sense of our belonging most of the times is imagined. We imagine that we belong to a place, to people that we do not know, or we may never get to know all of them. We imagine things that maybe we did not impose on ourselves. We did not create ourselves, were imposed on us. We can't really feel those things. They aren't tangible. Okay, so maybe we can continue. We have really good answers. Thank you so much for your engagement. And maybe the last question I would ask based on your answers then, because it seems to me that identity is really quite an important component of our lives based on your responses. So I was wondering, is national identity a myth then, or is it real? Is it a myth or is it real? Can we live without identifying with something? Is it possible to live without identifying with something or someone? So I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen as we are responding to this last question. Emma says, nationality is real because we believe in it. It's like money in that way. It only has the value that we allow it to have. Interesting. So we create nationalism. If we don't believe in it, it wouldn't exist. Sheriff, I believe national identity is real and also important. Indeed. Okay, I think it's not real. I believe values and rules we all follow. All right, so thank you all for your engagement. And one of the reasons for this, if you remember, I had mentioned the notion of the good life in politics or political science and international relations. The notion of the good life is truly very important to us. Who gets to benefit from the good life within a particular political community? How do you participate in the good life? Do you participate as a result of being a national of that country? Do you participate because you belong to a family? Do you participate because of your race, because of how you speak? Indeed, all of these iterations of belonging and identity are really important in deciding who gets what, when, and how. And that is why it's truly important that we study this, so that we can also see some of the gaps in the manner in which we approach identity and meaning making, in the manner in which we create the us and the them binary within a particular political system. So I want to talk about this notion of origin and nationhood. So when we think about the ideas of belonging expressed through notions of race, of ethnicity, of citizenship, of nationhood, what basically it tells us is that each one of us, we have a unique place, a place we call home in the world, and that place is ours, and that place is ours alone. And that other people, this is the danger sometimes of nationalism, that it tells us that we are very unique, we are very special, and that other people, they belong within this space, but they belong only when we regard them as visitors, as strangers, as immigrants, as newcomers. And sometimes if these people work hard enough, they may attain a certain level of belonging, maybe a diasporic citizen. Now, this order that we regard as the immigrant, as the stranger, as the visitor, in many countries and many parts of the world, particularly in the global north, this order is often framed as the economic or security threat to the nation state. Now we're getting into the problematic of identity, that when we think of a place as ours and ours alone, anybody coming into that space sometimes could be regarded as a threat. And that person may be seen as posing an economic or even a social security threat. Now, there are so many examples for that. And we can find these examples in the developing world, so-called, and also in the developed societies. And I want to begin with the debt crisis in the 1980s in some part of Africa, where structural adjustments programs by the IMF and the World Bank were imposed on a few countries. And Nigeria in particular was struggling in 1983. And so when Nigeria was struggling economically, the easy prey that they kind of focused attention on were the foreigners within the country. The foreigners became the economic threat, that if we're able to do away with these foreigners, then we will be stable economically. And so this led to the expulsion of especially the Ghanaians community in 1983. Now, the same phenomenon is going on in South Africa. And I'm sure some of us may not be unfamiliar with the terminology of xenophobia. South Africa, passed through what we call apartheid and gained independence in 1994. But independence did not necessarily bring about economic advancements for the Black South Africans. And so many foreigners in South Africa at the time, they also became the easy prey. The industrious foreigners who were occupying prestigious positions in government and business. And regardless, even the foreigners who are simply running away from, like I had mentioned, wars or climate change from their countries, they also became victims of xenophobic attacks because they are seen as coming into a new country to take over the jobs and the opportunities that only citizens are allowed to do. This phenomenon is not only restricted to Africa, of course. Even in the Netherlands, the trope of autochthony, or sometimes indigeneity, which means the idea that some people come from the soil, that some people are natural to the environment. They have used this idea to also discriminate against migrants, or to have a very fierce debate about the integration of migrants. Now, this bifurcation these days, we stamp this bifurcation through the use of identity cards, right? Such as the national ID cards. We all have the passports or even the indigenship certificate. And in some African countries, being born in an area does not even give you access to the social, economic, and political goods of that community or province, even if you are from the same country. So you could be born in, say, if I would use the context of Canada, you could be born in Manitoba, but because you are not indigene, whatever that means, you may not be able to access certain resources or political goods. And this is all because of the history of colonization, which, I mean, told certain group of people that this land is yours and yours alone. And anybody coming into your enclave is coming in as a stranger, is coming in as a visitor. So the idea of the border or homeland was then conceived as a way of keeping people enclosed in a space or enclaves for exploitative purposes, under the impression sometimes that their lives will be good, that they will be safe, that their lives will be worthwhile if they keep themselves separated from a more violent or predatory groups. The problem is that even people within a certain homeland or state may, depending on the circumstances, may be recategorized as non-citizens. You could be a citizen today in your country, and tomorrow something else may come up and you could be recategorized as a non-citizen. That is some of the dilemma of belonging that we are seeing, particularly in Myanmar, with the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas were once upon a time bona fide citizens, and all of a sudden, because of their religious identity, they are no longer citizens and are being expelled from the country. The Uyghurs in China, they also find themselves in the same circumstance. But then in the context of our globalized world, the migrants, the newcomer, or the diasporic citizen, they become the subject of this nervousness of belonging, particularly like I had mentioned in the periods of economic crisis, in the period of disease pandemic, and in the period of war. Now, if we think about what is going on in Ukraine, particularly when the war had started, Africans and Asian nationals were subjects of racism, right, at the various borders where Ukrainians were fleeing for refuge, and certain Africans and Asian nationals were discriminated at those borders, which is really quite intriguing that even within the context of complex emergency, that people are still able to think about who belong and who did not belong. And you could also think about the outbreak of the pandemic. And before the pandemic, there was Ebola. During Ebola, I remember when I traveled to certain parts of the world in Europe and Asia, I was also being discriminated because I was seen to carry a passport from West Africa. And so carrying the West African passport also meant that, in a way, I was the carrier of Ebola, even if I wasn't living in West Africa at the time. And that also happened before COVID-19 became a pandemic. People from certain part of the world also suffered discrimination. So these situations then highlight to us the despicable expression of this politics of origin. The politics of origin that kind of looks down on others based on their race, based on how they speak, based on class and nationality. So based on your responses, you realize that the things that make you who you think you are the same things sometimes that would make you to discriminate against other people, right? Other people also think the same thing of themselves, but then these same iterations of identity that, you know, give you your sense of self also gives you that spatial place. It makes you feel that sense of uniqueness that sometimes could also put you at odds, you know, with other people. So one of the questions I want to ask is the migrants a threat to nationalism? Like I had been kind of arguing. Is the migrant a threat to economic security, to social security, or to the attainment of the good life of true citizens? Or does the migrant contribute to the good life of the so-called bona fide citizens? So in order to answer this question, let's move to the next slide, which asks the question, who is actually a migrant? Because it's not a very straightforward question. You may ask, is a migrant a diasporic citizen? And by a diasporic citizen, I mean someone who had moved and taken on citizenship elsewhere and forged a community in that particular place. Is a migrant a refugee? And today, this concept is also very problematic because there are people from certain parts of the world that they do not want to be referred to as refugees. The Ukrainians have shown strong resilience in fighting the Russian aggression. And many of them do not want to leave their country as refugees, and they would prefer to stay than to have this marker of being a refugee. So when we use these concepts, sometimes let's problematize them. Is the migrant a student pursuing education elsewhere? Or is the migrant an asylum seeker waiting to be legally validated? People often ask me where I originally come from. That is a question many times you would encounter wherever you are, regardless whether you are in Nigeria or you are in Canada. If you're in Nigeria, people want to know, are you Hausa? Are you Igbo? Are you Yoruba? And remember that this is within the same country, right? And so people often ask me where I originally come from. And I used to be very quick to mention my country of birth, which I carry on my passport. But then later on, I realized the complexity of this question because I have lived in so many places in my life and I've attached myself to those places and people. And I've come to see myself as an extension of all these places. So it started becoming a little bit tricky to me to say that I belong to a particular place. But then in certain instances, as I've come to experience, the question of where are you from could actually be considered offensive. Even if you intended, have no evil or bad intention. So how do you begin a conversation with someone you think looks different from you or sounds different from you? Someone who speaks differently from you. How do you begin a conversation with that person? When I came to Canada for the first time, before then I had lived in Japan. And in Japan, where are you from is a very common statement. And probably also because of how I look, and people could see that I'm not part of the majority. So it's very easy to ask me that question. But then when I came to Canada, I realized it was a little bit different. I met a young man at an event whom I asked, where are you from? Because I have been asked the same question several times. And this man looked at me disgustingly and he asked me, when did you come to Canada? And surprised, with the look of bewilderment on my face, I mentioned to him that I had arrived to Canada 3 months earlier. And then he smiled understandably at me and said, you know what, my friend, I forgive you. I was like, oh, what is the point of forgiveness here? So he went on to say, my parents came from Pakistan, but I was born here in Canada, which means I am a Canadian. And I was shaking my head and I was like, wow, what an interesting answer. Now, you may think, this simple interchange made me to wonder, what makes someone a Canadian? What makes someone a Pakistani? What makes someone an Indian or a Rwandese or a Kenyan? Is it by virtue of being born in a place? Are you a Kenyan because you are born in Kenya? Are you an Indian because you are born in India? Are you a Canadian because you are born in Canada? Is it by having lived in this place for so long? And again, there are people who have lived in a place for so long and acquire citizenship status. There are people who were born in a place and acquire citizenship status. I'm sure there is a constitutional answer to this. But then the notion goes beyond constitution. The notion itself is quite interesting in terms of the formality of gaining citizenship and also the informality of obtaining it. And when I talk about the informality of citizenship, I talk about people like myself who have traveled and lived in so many parts that I feel in a way that I belong to all these places at once. Whether those countries, give me citizenship or not, I feel a strong sense of connection to those places. You may actually obtain citizenship in Canada or the US, and you will still feel a strong sense of connection to your home country, maybe in the Philippines where you were born, or in India, or in Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So whether this young man that I had this exchange with is Pakistani or Canadian or both, or even a global citizen, it is clear that identity formation, right? It is clear that this sense of identity is complex. It is not very straightforward. It is very fluid. It is very elastic. Depending on what group I am today, I may speak with a certain accent because I want to feel that I'm part of that community. And then I find myself in another group, and then I also change to adapt, to that particular community. So we are always in a state of flux, right? In a state of change, but also permanence. So although I can obtain citizenship in Canada and feel like a Canadian, my identity could be nothing short of a foreigner to others. You may still think you are a citizen, but you could also be considered a foreigner based on how you look, or even the type of job that you do, or even the way and the manner that you speak. So again, I'm going back to your responses to say, these very things that you think make you quite unique are also the things that some people could use to tell you that you are not unique and that you do not belong in this particular space. So it is no wonder that those who have obtained citizenship or even permanent residency in certain parts of the world where maybe they were not born in, they have been placed under questionable sociological categories. Sometimes we refer to those people as the first generation, the second generation immigrants, newcomers. And these are the people sometimes who are racialized in the body politics of nationalism. So this is where nationalism begins to become a little bit tricky, that it gives, it gives you a sense of pride, it gives you a sense of connection, but it also identifies you as a unique person who is different from other people. So in this way, the people who have obtained this citizenship are merely bureaucratic citizens who are left on the periphery as spectators with the sensation but not the experience of citizenship. Excuse me. So they have come to stand in for the subordinated race, regardless of whether they have been able to assimilate the culture of the dominated culture. So you may be able to speak in a language of the dominant group. You may be able to look like the dominant group, but there must still be something about you that could be used to discriminate, that you do not belong in this particular space. You do not have the history of these people. You are not, a member from the soil, the autochthony that I had mentioned earlier. But then we could also ask, isn't the sense or a sense of origin, the fact that you belong to a particular place, isn't it a good thing? Why should we cringe when we are asked where we come from? Why is it a problem when people are asked, where do you come from? If origin is a problematic thing, then why are people, for example, I have met a few people from the Caribbean who would ask me, Ben, why are the African governments not inviting us back home? Because many of us are slaves here who have been deposited in the Caribbean, and our ultimate desire is to return home to Africa. We have also seen this with the Black or African Americans. There is this nervousness to return to the motherland. We have also seen so many people on Ancestry.com trying to figure out their roots. Now, these are very pertinent questions to ask in the context of the notion of nationalism and rootedness in a place. It is also worth inquiring whether an individual can be rooted to a place and still be able to live as a transnational or global citizen. So the question I want to ask is, does being rooted, does being born in Canada mean that you can only be a Canadian? Does being born in India or in the Philippines mean that you can only be a Filipino or an Indian? Or can you be an Indian, a Filipino, a Canadian, an American, and more? In other words, can belonging be local and global at the same time? Do we need to start thinking in this very inclusive sense? And if we need to think in this sense, why should we think in this way? Do migrants seeking citizenship or refuge or education elsewhere, do they destroy the constitution of the nation state, of the destination country, or do they strengthen such structure in some ways? To answer this question, we go to our final slide, and that is thinking about the survival of the nation state. What does belonging mean for the survival of the nation state? Now, when I talk about global identity, when I say that I feel like I belong to many places at once, I do not mean that the nation state would cease to exist, because the nation state is still very important. The idea of globalization, the idea of people traveling, political ideas merging, the idea of people agreeing to universal standard, it doesn't dismiss the idea of the nation state. Globalization processes, as we know, they still take place within the frameworks created by the historical emergence of the nation state. The nation state still sets the rules. It sets the parameters for how globalization happens, for how people come in and settle in a new country and become, citizens, or even study, or, visit for whatever purpose. But then at the same time, also, a strong interconnected relations and mutual constitutions exist between so-called local, but also global spaces, between the inside and the outside of nations. And these interconnected relationships, we need to start acknowledging them. Many of us would come into Canada or go elsewhere as international students. And that is already part of that global, local relationship. These have been very central to the operations of our political, our social, and economic relationships. So in this respect, the border that I had mentioned, which is the mark or the marker of distinction, it could be conceived as less than a limit and more as a place and also a condition that cultivates a postmodern kind of living. We have to start acknowledging that the border is not a place that shuts people out. It's not a place that shuts citizens and non-citizens. It's a place where these different iterations of identities, they meet together and they forge something very meaningful, very progressive, right? In attaining the good life that I had mentioned earlier. It is at the border, be it physical or psychological, that the lifeblood of two worlds merges to form what is called a border culture. This culture is the product of those who are not supposed to be able to create or to be anything of value. These sometimes are supposedly people that we regard to as the irrational, the abnormal, the non-citizen, the disease infiltrated. These are the people that we have created in the formative colonial logics of political science. So, in conclusion, I think we should start thinking of the border not as a place of restriction, but as a place and also a condition of being and becoming. It is a psychic space that is brought into being both by oppression and violence against those who are often considered strange, who are considered non-conformist or incompetent citizens with abnormal behaviors. All the more important to emphasize before we leave today is that migration is as old as human society. We will continue to move, and we need to come up with different ideas of belonging that would be more inclusive rather than exclusionary. A universe that is only restricted to autochthony or indigenes or natives is not a universe that includes. It is a universe that keeps people apart. It's a universe that says there is an order as well as elsewhere who does not belong to this political community. Yes, we need to recognize the rights of people in a given place, but we also need to start thinking beyond some of the restrictive notions of purity that we use. Because the human relationship is not based on purity, it is based both on sameness and difference, on oneness as well as the dignity of our difference. So I'm going to leave it here, because no matter how we try to resist it, difference and sameness is part of our human condition. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much on behalf of Lakehead International, but also our audience. With that being said, before we let you go, we do have a couple of audience questions, and I'm sure now that we head into the Q&A period, I'm sure we'll receive more. So Dr. Maiangwa, if you open the Q&A button on your end, you'll actually see some of the open questions we've already received. I'll pose the first question to you because I think it actually ties in quite strongly to your final point of what is change and what does it look like essentially. So the question is, how can a country begin to change its own views of immigrants as threats? Are there any countries that have successfully integrated a large expat population without major societal impact or change?
It's a very good question. And I think some countries are doing better than others. That is the way I would put it. We are increasingly in a period where far-right movements are emerging. And one characteristic of far-right movement is that they are not very open to the idea of immigration. And the French government had an election recently. And of course, it was a context, between the left and right. And many people are rejoicing that the left won that election. And but we have seen so many far-right, politicians taking the stage. We saw that with Donald Trump in the US. So this is an indication that in as far as we are making progress, people are still scared about the extent of the progress that we are making. People are worried, that they are going to lose out in the end. So I think politicians have a lot in terms of trying to calm the nerves of people, to help them understand that, this progress in terms of our inclusivity is indeed for the benefits of the growth of the nation state, which is truly becoming something much more global than the way we used to think about it. So some countries are doing better than others. That is the way I'll put it. And it maybe boils down to the individual, to start inculcating that attitude within.
For sure. And to build on that, I'm curious, this is coming from a personal just reference or reflection on your answer. Do you think it's the nation state's obligation to integrate that into education and to teach the young citizens of each nation state why it's important and what importance brings from immigration and culture and diversity?
Exactly. And I think education is a very good platform where where this attitude of inclusivity could be nurtured. I mean, my classes at Lakehead are quite diverse. And when you look at the diversity already, you feel very proud that, something great is already happening. And diversity is an opportunity, to strengthen the human connection even more. And so the classroom definitely is a place where these concepts are interrogated. And at Lakehead is something that we really engage with. It's truly a diverse community.
Awesome. So another question we have is, do you think the world will be able to better dissolve political boundaries when we have more monetary equality?
Monetary equality. I think political boundaries would always be there, but to what extent they would be there, it's questionable. Monetary equality, we're already also seen in different forms. We have the international monetary system, but we also have a regional monetary system, because there are certain groups that are left out of the whole calculus of globalization who are really trying to come up with something that would be more, that would work best for their own people and region. We have that with the European Union, with the Economic Community of the West African States, and so on. So we may have it at a global stage, but we could also have it, at a very regional level. So those kinds of arrangements, I think they are really helping in breaking down some of the political barriers of nationalism.
Awesome. So we do have another open question related to Nigeria and some of the current situation there, I'll say, but I'll let you read it and phrase it, and then if you're comfortable answering it, I'll let you empower you to do that.
You read it for me. I'm not able to identify the question here.
For sure, yeah. So it says, how and what possible ways can an African country like Nigeria do away with the concept of belonging and nationhood, looking at the complexities of the political system that are full of ethnic and religious sentiments in every ramification?
It's a very good question, not just for Nigeria, but for many post-colonial countries who were created out of a forged medley of different groups by the colonizers. Now, I don't necessarily think that diversity is a bad thing or difference is a bad thing. Like I had mentioned, we have to start warming up to the idea of the dignity of human difference. That difference is very good, and there are some societies doing truly well with multiculturalism. What it may boil down to is the idea of a leader who can cut across this diversity and really palliate the fear or the fears that people have, about the other. So a country like Nigeria definitely may not need to dissolve into various groups, but if that is what the groups want, because self-determination is also a right of people, so they need to have a conversation, and having a conversation rather than and I know in the context of Nigeria, there have so many separatist groups that haven't necessarily been dealt with by the government in a very accommodating sense. So having that sense of accommodating diversity, diverse views, by a leader, I think would be a step forward. And also thinking about notions of indigeneity, this idea that if you are not born in a particular place, you cannot get a job in that place, or you cannot even get admission, educational opportunity in that place. I think Nigeria and so many other post-colonial societies, they need to think of a way to do away with that idea that indigeneity fixes you to a particular community or state, and you belong to that state alone. So that idea needs to be, in a way, engaged with.
Awesome. And for the final question we have time for today, the question is, do you think that state sovereignty stands at odds with migration, considering that one of the defining factors state sovereignty is permanent population?
State sovereignty now has been, the notion of state sovereignty has been revised to mean responsibility. We talk about the responsibility to protect. That sovereignty means nothing if that particular state doesn't provide the necessary political goods even to its own citizens. So we are beginning to see this notion being expanded. So if you belong to the wider global community, your state sovereignty also applies, to anybody who wants to take on refuge in that particular state, because you belong to the committee of nations, under the banner of the United Nations and other institutions of global governance. So due to these institutions of global governance, state sovereignty is no longer restricted to the idea of a confined territory. It is also applied as a responsibility that that state has, to its own neighbors and to also other members of the global community. So we should start thinking about this expansive, notion of state sovereignty.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for answering those questions. I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I want to remind our viewers before we wrap up today, I encourage you to follow us on our social media channels. You can find us at Lakehead International on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. If you're curious what our campuses look like, what our buildings are like, lab facilities, residents, all that sort of stuff, you can take a virtual campus tour over at lakeheadu.ca/tours. If you want to check out some of our other sample lectures, maybe get a taste for criminology, a taste for psychology. We just recently, last week, hosted an engineering session with the Dean of Engineering. That is available on our YouTube, or you can scan that QR code for some of those upcoming events. I want to take this opportunity for first and foremost thanking you, Dr. Maiangwa, for joining us and sharing that sample lecture. It was phenomenal in my opinion, and I think the audience would agree with me because the chat was definitely booming and we got quite a few questions in the Q&A. So thank you again for joining us. To our audience, I can't thank you enough for the participation and the engagement. It always enhances these sessions, and of course, it's been a pleasure hosting you. Hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Dr. Maiangwa, I'll let you have the final couple words and then we'll wrap it up here.
Just to thank you, Jordan, for organizing this lecture, and to thank the audience for truly a very engaging participation. I wish we had more time to engage with some of the questions that they have raised, but you'll definitely find me here at Lakehead once you come, and we're looking forward to continuing this very important conversation. So thank you so very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And to our audience, I will once again encourage you to check out some of those other upcoming events to get a taste of what it's like to be a student here at Lakehead University. On that note, folks, I'll wrap it up here and say bye for now. See you at the next one.
Thank you for checking out today's video. If you have any questions, you can always comment below. Stay connected and follow us on our social media channels to stay informed about upcoming webinars and get an insider sneak peek of Lakehead University. See you next time.